Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Well, Canada has a new prime minister and an election call seems imminent. So, can the new Liberal leader be the change that Canadians have been looking for the last couple of years, or has the whole question changed? Of course, on the other side of things, the tariff war escalates in response to Ontario's charge on electricity. Donald Trump has now suggested he's going to double the tariffs again. So, how does that all interplay into the Canadian election, which we will probably see sooner as opposed to later? Darrell Bricker, CEO of Ipsos, author of a dozen books. He is somewhere in Europe today. We're not sure on what time zone he's on. Darrell, good to see you. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on. I'm just in Brussels, so it's not so bad.
You're in Brussels. Are you solving Mideast peace or the Ukraine war?
No, I'm solving Ipsos issues, so I'm dealing with
All
those.
right.
It's
Well, let's jump into it. Just on that basic question, I think it's fair to say that the ballot question is no longer just about change, with Justin exiting the stage, Justin Trudeau exiting, and the Liberals having a new leader. So, is that? I'll just pose the question: does that represent the change for many people that they were looking for?
I think it's still a very open question. I mean, one of the things that we've seen, obviously, is the evaporation of support for the Conservative Party that was basically campaigning on it's just time for a change. I think
Yeah.
at this point, people are agreeing that it's time for a change, but the question is what kind of change? And it's not like the Liberals have moved ahead of the Conservatives by a considerable number as a result of the coronation of Mark Carney. There's one poll, the one that we did, that showed them slightly ahead by a couple of points, but it's not like they've moved into a 25-point lead over the Conservatives. So what we've done is we've just created a situation that's competitive, which didn't exist before.
So, what does that mean in terms of what the next steps are for people? We're seeing some of the early attempts to define this, which is Mark Carney represents a fourth Liberal term, not change. And the Liberals, for their Carney was very strong in his speech the other night. Pierre Poilievre is will kneel at the knee of Trump. That was pretty the Trump altar. So is that how the two sides are going to go about defining this, roughly speaking?
That's what appears to be happening. I mean, it's a good argument for the Liberals. I mean, when we go out and we do polling, there is a concern about Pierre Poilievre looking a bit too much like Donald Trump in terms of the way he presents himself and how he
Mm.
presents his interests. And Pierre Poilievre's pardon me, commentary about Mark Carney not really representing actual change from the Liberal Party of the past is a valid argument. And what's been really interesting, Senator, is to this point, both of those candidates have really been campaigning against other people.
Right.
So Pierre Poilievre has been campaigning against Justin Trudeau, and Mark Carney, to the extent that he's been out there talking and positioning himself, is really positioning himself against Donald Trump.
Yeah.
We're now going to get into a situation in which these two candidates are going to campaign against each other. Doesn't mean those two issues aren't going to come up, but I think we're going to get something a bit more robust in terms of the content.
You've been, I'm sure, looking at the ad wars too, where the conservative ads are putting Carney in the dark light there, sneaky, no
Like a red
experience.
light, I've
Yeah,
noticed.
a
It's like
red
a very
light.
red
Yeah,
light.
it's
Yeah.
very fair weather Canadian, globalist, elitist, all of those things. And then the liberal ads are the same, which is they're juxtaposing Trump's language with his language and saying it's all one and the same. What does that suggest to you? We're going to be into the. I'm thinking back to Harper was going to put troops in the streets and all of that. Looks like it's going to be nasty.
Yeah, I think probably one of the nastiest campaigns we've experienced, and we've experienced some pretty nasty
Yeah.
campaigns, but both of them going in hard negative. I expect that they're going to mix in a few positives along the way. I mean, Mark Carney feels he's got some things to brag about, and Pierre Poilievre has some things that he feels are important that he can brag about. But really, the effort here, particularly for the Conservatives, is going to be defining Mark Carney.
Hmm.
The Liberals have to also try to define Pierre Poilievre, but it's less about defining him than more about pressing on a button that already exists.
Yeah.
So the Conservatives are going to be very aggressively trying to define Mark Carney. The Liberals are going to be trying to present Pierre Poilievre as a risk. And what we know at this point is that the Conservatives do have an outcome that they're favored for, which is change.
Yeah.
It's an easier argument for them to make than it is for Mark Carney to make. And the Liberals have their argument, which is leaving the negative side to the side of Pierre Poilievre, which is we have the best person to govern during this troubling times. So the question that we're going to be facing is the conservative type of change that they're going to own the type of change that we want? And on the conservative side, it's going to be, is Mark Carney everything that he appears to be? So the question is, which one of those questions come up as the defining element of the campaign? Now, you were around the 1988 election campaign, as was I,
Yeah.
and really, it all turned on whether or not you felt that John Turner was credible and authentic in the way that he was presenting himself. And it's very much similar to what the Conservatives are going
Yeah,
to
there are a
be
lot of
confronted with.
echoes, a lot of
Yeah,
echoes
so
of that. Yeah. Um, the Liberals have been able to, I think, quite effectively use Trump's trade war as a wedge issue. To really, this is the party that said Canada is bad, we are racist, we are homophobic, we are, we have to tear down the statues and lower the flag. And now they have become a group of Captain Canadas wrapping themselves in the flag. And it's been hard for the others to find any space there at all. Is that going to continue to work? And I guess I put this in the context of the issue seemed to be at one point affordability. It's now become the future of our country.
right. So the first part is the assumption that the Liberals actually own that.
Hmm.
And the reality is they don't. It's a fairly confusing question for Canadians.
Okay.
So they haven't settled on who the Captain Canada is at this stage of the game. It might even be people like Doug Ford.
Yeah.
So where the Mark Carney sits in all of that is not really defined. Where Pierre Poilievre sits in that is not really defined either. So I think that we shouldn't assume that the Liberals actually own this, because I think there's a lot of questions about that. Really, it was interesting. We did a survey for Global News a couple of weeks ago, in which we looked at the CV elements or the resume elements for Mark
Right.
Carney, and asked some questions about that. So we said, so Mark Carney best able to deal with Donald Trump. Now there are certain surveys that are showing that people do believe that. Our survey didn't show that. They showed the two leaders actually quite close, and Pierre Poilievre slightly ahead of Mark Carney on that. Then we asked,
Mm.
who would be able to best, kind of bring the country together and put policies in place in order to protect Canadians from what's going on. And you would think, based on Mark Carney's resume and what he says, that he would be seen as the person to do that. At this stage of the game, at least, 7 or 8 days ago, 2 weeks ago, Canadians actually saw Pierre Poilievre further ahead on that point. The only question on the free trade debate that really was defining for those two party leaders, that really differentiated them,
Yeah.
was whether or not one of them would be more likely to roll over for Donald Trump.
Right.
And that's where Carney has a huge advantage over
Yeah.
Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah.
So Pierre Poilievre's seen as much more likely to do that. So
Hence
it's
the
interesting.
line in the speech, which is he will kneel at the altar. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's actually the operative element in this debate on dealing with the United States. It's not Mark Carney's, like all the stuff about having dealt with risk and all the rest of it. Maybe Canadians will build up to that, but at the moment, they don't see him as advantaged on that. The only thing that is operating here is whether or not they fear that Pierre Poilievre would roll over for Donald Trump. So
Yeah.
that's the opportunity for the Liberals, but it's also the issue that the Conservatives have to deal with.
We're kind of seeing this the Davos man, the globalist, the elitist, the guy that's on on the environmental bandwagon with GANs and all of that versus the MAGA man. Um, if that's kind of crudely put, but that's sort of how each will be presenting the other.
Yeah, and I would say the MAGA man is the real vulnerability. The Davos man, nobody's really that sure about it. Where Mark Carney comes into trouble on some of these questions is things like, for example, making too much of the role that he played in the
Right.
in the financial crisis back in 2008. There's too much you can fact check on that, and other people have opinions. And particularly when you're seen as being kind of a truth teller and somebody who's going to be honest about all of these things, that's a vulnerability. And particularly when people don't really know who you are, these things, as they were for Kim Campbell, take on an exaggerated level of importance as people try to define who you are. So they've got a bit of a problem on that front. They've also, on the policy front, it's not like Canadians are looking at them as having any great plan for being able to deal with this. By the way, they don't look at the Conservatives as being particularly well suited to
Yeah.
deal with this either. So there's a lot of things that have to get worked out. I think people are misreading the debate and the contest between Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney. I don't think it's really, and the data don't show that it's really about Mark Carney is seen as being so much smarter and so much more experienced and all those things, because Canadians don't really know that.
Yeah.
It's the vulnerability of Pierre Poilievre on that question of whether or not he is able to stand up to Trump. And the way that the Conservatives seem to have an opportunity for the Liberal Party and against the Liberal Party and Mark Carney is his authenticity. So when he does brag about things that
Yeah.
you could ask some questions about, it undermines his authenticity. So he has to be really careful too. But
And there's been enough flaws in that argument about the his failure to be forthcoming about Brookfield, or the counter that we're now seeing, particularly in the British press, about what he really did in terms of Brexit, or what he really did in Canada in terms of the '08 economic crisis. There's just question marks around a lot of things.
right, so it's a definitional question for Mark Carney.
Yeah.
And to on the credit side of this, he's got a lot of experience, and nobody can deny that. And he's
Right.
can go through chapter and verse what he's been involved in, trying not to over egg it, because that's what's going to get him into trouble. But the other thing is that he's also been on the public stage for a long time, and even though he hasn't run for office, there's so much information out there about him
Yeah.
that the Tories can use to ask questions about him. So this early part of that campaign, if we're going to be into a campaign, this early part of the campaign is really going to be about defining Mark Carney.
It's interesting as you watch kind of the mainstream media respond to his both his launch and then his acceptance speech the other night, that nobody will say this guy is the most dynamic speaker you've ever seen, or charismatic on a stage. But many have concluded that that is sort of what Canadians want right now. That again, they're feeling Poilievre is sharp and edgy, and that Mr. Bland is somehow letting people calm those fears they have about dealing with Trump. We'll come to the flip side of that in a moment, of dealing with Trump, but the first part first.
I think that's them overinterpreting what they're seeing with their own eyes and
Okay,
giving their own views of what they think is appropriate.
just an
You know,
opinion.
the Laurentian elite's got a Laurentian elite, right? I mean, they're all looking for Lester Pearson.
Yes,
They're
exactly.
all they're all looking for that, and times have changed.
Yeah.
So I think that that's them looking and seeing what they want, rather than sitting back and actually looking at what Canadians themselves say. The interesting thing on all this, Senator, is that it's not like the other issues that existed before haven't gone away. And it's interesting when you see that the rise of Mark Carney in the Liberal Party, it's actually older people that are coming on side
Yeah.
rather than younger people. So there's still all those issues that are roiling away underneath as we deal with the issue of Donald Trump and the United States, which has absolutely moved to the top of the
Yeah,
hit
the
parade.
top of the list. Just
Yeah.
just before we go there, because I want to go there instantly, but the vote itself, with the the rather strange membership configuration that liberals have, which is if you're over 14, you can just be a member and it doesn't really cost anything. It led to huge voting problems, 400,000 and change registered, 150,000 or some voting. So this was the vote of a very small percentage of people who consider themselves liberals in Canada. So again, that kind of speaks to the age thing. The people that were able to manage the technology were younger, or not, because if they were, then that bodes well for Carney that the younger ones were out there and still voted.
Yeah, that's not what the polls are showing.
Okay. All right, let's go. Let's just go to Mr. Trump. So we have Doug Ford saying, "I'm going to go ahead with my charge on electricity," and Trump had already said, if there's any proactive, moves, I'm going to double everything else, which he's now said as of today. Who knows what will happen? And at the same, and Doug Ford's been over the media today saying this is all his fault. He's the guy. But he's also said in the last 24 hours that, he's literally been praising Carney and deliberately silent about Polyev. So that seems to be another issue that's boiling under the surface. There's the old thinking that, of course, if you're a conservative in Ontario, you want a liberal in Ottawa, it makes your politics better. What do you think we're actually seeing there?
I don't think that they're sending each other's Christmas cards in the leadership of the
Right.
Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario and the Federal Conservative Party. There's always been a bit of a difference, and Doug Ford does have national leadership aspirations.
Right.
You're seeing him basically role play that right now
Yeah.
and test it out. So there's all sorts of things going on here within whatever those family squabbles are, and I don't even know that you could consider them to be a family.
Yeah, because they're two different parties at this point. Okay, so Donald Trump, what this is the key issue for Polyev, as how does he define himself as somebody who can stand up to Trump when he's being described as kneeling at the altar. So what does he do? I mean, when he speaks, he says this is unacceptable. He does all of that, but without Parliament sitting, there's very few venues also for an opposition leader. We'll talk about the NDP too, who seem to have fallen right off the map. But first, how does Polyev deal with that?
Well, I think he's trying to deal with it right now in terms of his own public presentation. And then the other thing, of course, is the conservatives are going to attack, and you can judge it whether it's right or wrong. They're going to say, well, actually, the only person who's made a decision about whether to change anything on behalf of Donald Trump, and it was on behalf of Brookfield, was Mark Carney.
Yeah.
Now, you can get into what that actually was about, but you know as well as I do, Senator, that when you're explaining, you're losing
Yeah.
in politics. So, and then having an answer like, I wasn't precise enough,
Yeah.
sounds like you were too stupid to understand what I meant, which is unfortunately for these guys, this group of liberals, the Justin Trudeau, now Mark Carney liberals, I don't want to put them together, but it is
But it's the
basically
same
the same
team
group.
behind them
Yeah,
in
it's the
many
same group.
respects. Yeah.
These people seem to have a very difficult time when they're caught in a difficult situation, actually just saying something in a very plain way that a normal person could understand it.
Yeah.
So that was presents opportunities for Polyev. And at some point, he's going to be able to challenge who is going to be the prime minister, Mark Carney, quite directly on questions like this. And it'll be interesting to see if he's able to better deal with them, because it wasn't a great moment for him.
Yeah. And the media, of course, has been I was reading something today that there hasn't been a mention of the word Brookfield in CBC coverage, for example, since the end of February. Like there's that whole theory again that mainstream media is sort of protecting him in the same way that they did, and that is going to inevitably influence public thinking one way or the other.
Well, I think one of the things that's really interesting these days is you watch the main media and I watch the main media, but not a lot of Canadians do.
Yeah, well, that's true.
I mean, they're more likely to get their interpretation of Pierre Poilievre or Mark Carney watching the Food Network and the ads that come on as they're,
Yeah.
as they're watching Bobby Flay, as they are to be watching the nightly news on the CBC. I mean, what's the CBC get these days? 300,000 viewers. I mean, that's it.
Yeah, I think that's a
Back
good.
in the day when you were doing it, it was in the millions.
Yeah, no, the numbers are very different. So then that's where the ad campaign becomes really strategic. It's you mentioned the Food Network. I actually saw it on, the Hallmark, the
Yeah.
Home Network, all of those things, which obviously designed to find the women that are more, bigger vulnerability for the conservatives.
Right. And the one thing that we know about the conservatives is they've got a war chest beyond war chests,
Yeah,
historically the biggest one in Canadian political history. The question is, how are they going to use it? And one of the incentives for the Liberals to actually go to the Governor General and say they want to have an election is to blunt that
yeah.
capability. But uh,
Because
and
there are
it's a difficult.
spending limits, just to explain, once the election is called, then spending becomes
And the
constrained.
Liberals have a
Yeah.
slight advantage because they have more seats. But,
Yeah.
I said in the New York Times, I was quoted in the New York Times today on something that I think is a real difficult problem for the Liberal Party. Mark Carney campaigning as a politician is not the strongest Mark Carney.
Yeah.
Mark Carney governing is actually his campaign. I
Yeah.
mean, showing that he can do the job is actually his campaign. So I'm wondering if there's a bit more of a debate happening within his team about whether they should call an election than maybe everybody is assuming. Because
Yeah,
as a politician, he's not great.
that was the whole debate, that he would want to stay, that he would want to chair the G7 meeting, that he would want to, as you say, play to his strengths and let people see him in the chair. But the issue is he doesn't have a seat, so he wouldn't actually be in Parliament. So that's the argument on the other side. Just get to an election, get a seat, and then come back.
But governing's not happening in Parliament.
Right.
Governing is going to be happening with him holding first ministers conferences and
Right.
and going to the United States and having the entire press corps following him there. It's going to be him being decisive and him with that great, calm demeanor, dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis, bringing Canadians together to be able to combat what's going on. And when you get into an election campaign in which you don't get a chance to do that, you're constantly dealing with the attacks of the conservatives, and that's when, by the way, even though the Liberals will have a bit of a slight spending advantage, you have to wonder how much money they've got,
Hmm.
even when they have that. And the other thing is that the Conservatives get to respond in kind of an equivalent way. You're going to get into debates with Pierre Poilievre, and Mark Carney was probably fantastic when he was at the Oxford Union or wherever he happened to practice what he
Right.
was doing. But he's about to enter into a combat with somebody who was put together with spare body parts from elite killers in the basement of Tory headquarters. This guy plays Smash Mouth, and it's going to be tough. And Mark Carney's not the kind of guy who's used to having people do that to him. He's used to doing the hand steeples in
Right.
boardrooms and on panels in which
Right.
people treat him with deep respect. Pierre Poilievre is going to do anything but,
Yeah.
and it'll be interesting to see how he deals with that.
On debate stages. So let's just imagine for a moment the first phone call or the first meeting, which will happen between Carney and Trump, and this is pre-election, and Polyev will have to try and at some point do the same, just for equivalency, just to put himself there. How do you just first describe how you think the Carney-Trump meeting goes? These are two very different kind of people.
Well, if we saw what happened to Justin Trudeau, he just basically brought him in and humiliated him and laughed at him. I
Mhm.
mean, it's interesting the contrast with Zelensky, where they actually gave him the dignity of getting angry with him.
Yeah,
They didn't
yeah,
even do that to Justin Trudeau. They just laughed at him
yeah,
and continued to do so. So is he going to treat Mark Carney the same way? And the problem in all of these things is nobody can control Donald Trump, and you
yeah,
can't predict his behavior. So it's as risky for Mark Carney as it is as an opportunity. And who knows if he's even going to agree to meet with him.
yeah.
So he's the Donald Trump is the wild card, and same thing for Pierre Poilievre. I mean, what's going to happen in that meeting? I
If
mean,
he's
is
trying to
JD
go
Vance going
down
to
and
yell at him?
say,
I mean,
Yeah, like how does that work? Because he's got to criticize him to his face if Polyev is going to try and keep his version of Captain Canada alive.
Um, it will be interesting to see because, Polyev's used to being the critic, right? He's used
Yeah.
to being somebody who can, and the guy has, skin like a rhinoceros. I mean, he's pretty tough. Mark Carney, as I said before, is a kind of person who's used to hand steeples and boardrooms,
Hmm.
and he does that kind of thing. And it will be an interesting situation for him to deal with somebody like Donald Trump. And it's funny, he claims that he has dealt with Donald Trump. There's no evidence of that.
Yeah.
Again, over egging, and it's not necessary. I don't know why.
Yeah.
He's such an
It's not.
accomplished person. You
Yeah.
don't have to say you've done
The
more than you've
CV
done.
is good
Yeah,
enough.
but again, I mean, so what Donald Trump laughs at Mark Carney, what does that do for Mark Carney?
Yeah.
I don't know that there's necessarily any great advantages in political terms for meeting with Donald Trump since he
Or
can't
trying to
control him.
take it. The 50, I mean, the irony of all of this is that Trump has actually breathed life into the Liberal Party. I mean, they were losing when the issue was affordability, and when Donald Trump made it all about the 51st state and tariffs, the Liberals were literally back from the dead overnight. So if he
Well, it kind of
continues,
took two things, though, Senator.
yeah,
It took Justin Trudeau leaving. So
yeah,
if
no,
if
no,
Donald
absolutely.
Trump was doing what he's doing today, would there be a huge rallying to the flag behind Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party? Maybe a bit, but
Yeah,
25 points changing? Probably not. I mean, if Kamala
yeah,
Harris had won the election and Mark Carney was moving into this job, do you think that Mark Carney would be moving up the way that we've seen the Liberal Party move up? Probably
right.
not.
Yeah. No, no, it wouldn't have
Taking the
been.
two things.
So the 51st state stuff, just I don't know what you're getting in the public opinion polls. We're seeing a lot of we'll call it patriotism on the part of Canadians looking for flags, canceling vacations, checking the labels on everything to see that they're not buying anything from the US. Is that I always have mixed views about this. It really has no impact on Donald Trump. I mean, he really doesn't care. And if you don't buy Kentucky bourbon or you don't go to a movie made in California, he doesn't care. Is there some way to make this a more positive thing in Canada, or is it already?
Well, the country was pretty much at a breaking point before this. I mean, and the breaking point has become more pronounced as we're moving through this. I mean, this is an existential statement about what the future of Canada is going to be. I mean,
Right.
and Donald Trump, okay, so 2 years from now he loses the midterm elections and
Right.
loses control of Congress, and maybe things back down a little bit. I mean, who knows? It's unpredictable. But I think where Mark Carney is actually absolutely quite correct. This is less about the United States and it's more about us.
Yeah.
So, the rumor now is that they're not going to have tariffs on oil and gas products going to the United States. Okay, well, that's great for Alberta and Saskatchewan and maybe some other folks, but it's not great for the rest of the country if they're placing 50% tariffs on aluminum and steel, which
Yeah.
punishes places like the province of Quebec.
Well,
So how do we maintain national unity in this kind of a situation?
this is the trouble with all of these things, even the interprovincial trade barriers. I mean, 1,000 reasons to take those all down, but it also unleashes all of the regional differences. I mean, I think everybody fell off their chairs the other night when Chrétien seemed to imply that we could somehow have a pipeline from Alberta to Quebec. He didn't say go further east, but while Quebec, remains an awful lot of resistance there. But as you say, I mean, when somebody has tariffs and the other person doesn't, it just feeds all that stuff, whether, you're buying Canadian jam or not, right?
And for those younger voters who feel that the Canadian promise is not paying off for them, I mean, we went out and interviewed people and we said, okay, if you'd have full U.S. citizenship and your assets would be valued in American dollars, you wouldn't lose anything. Would you vote to become an American? 30% of Canadians said yes.
And that's the younger demo.
Gen Z, it was almost half.
Yeah.
So we've got issues. I mean, you can't spend 10 years telling Canadians that they're a post-national state and everything that they did in the past was terrible and expect them to take great pride in their country. I mean, there's
On
a
a
lot of
dime.
stuff
Yeah.
going on here. Is the Canadian promise paying off for young people? I mean, what's happening with immigration and new Canadians? I mean, we've got to get that sorted out. You mentioned interprovincial trade barriers, but it's more than just interprovincial trade barriers. It's whether or not we can get any infrastructure projects in this country launched at all to take
Well,
advantage of what
that's the
our
thing. I
big,
mean,
yeah.
until there is some change in the actual rules, we can talk all we want about another pipeline, but right now you can't build one. You just technically can't build one. It takes too long.
Yeah, Pierre Poilievre, when he said, Canada's broken, a lot of Canadians actually agreed with him. So I know
Yeah.
the Liberals are kind of turning that on him, but there's a lot of people just below the surface of this fight that we're having with the United States who don't feel that this country is working the way that it should be. Now, Mark Carney has an opportunity here too. And you've been seeing that he's been, tacking back on some of the policies that are more problematic for
Mhm.
the Liberal Party relative to what Canadians are thinking. So there's an opportunity for him to do a bit of a fresh start. What's interesting is this whole Trump situation and the resignation of Justin Trudeau has created an opportunity in the minds of Canadians to actually have a bit of a fresh start for the Liberal Party,
Yeah.
which is what's one of the things that's interesting here. I mean, as I said before, Pierre Poilievre wants to run against Justin Trudeau and his record, but Canadians are living in the here and now in the near future. So
Yeah.
they're not spending a lot of time talking about what the past was. And so there's an opportunity for the Liberals to do exactly what they're doing. And as a result of that, it's going to be a very competitive election.
And as you say, when you get into debate mode, I mean, it was a moment the other night when Carney said he was going to do away with the consumer carbon tax, but he's already announced the shadow carbon tax that he calls it, perhaps even putting more taxes on Americans at the border. So, that's not been discussed much, but that happens once a campaign starts, and that's the kind of thing Polyev will be pointing out every 15 minutes.
Yeah, and so Carney's position right now is the way Canadians are reacting to him is like they're meeting someone new.
Yeah.
So what do I know about you? It's like anytime you meet somebody new, like who are these people? Who is this
Yeah.
person? What are they all about? What can you learn about their past that can help you understand who they are all about? And of course, they've got people on their side that are saying they're the greatest people in the world, and then you've got the conservatives on the other side saying, oh, well, he's terrible, and this is why, and it's
Yeah.
going to be a fight over those two things. And at this point, it's difficult to know what's going to happen. And the way I describe it, Senator, is it's like, the new car smell in a new car, right?
Yeah.
That's the way people are feeling about Mark Carney right now. But the question is, can the Conservatives turn him into an air freshener and an old clunker?
Yeah.
And that's what they're going to try and do.
No, I think that's and the age-old issues still stand, which is the rural urban or the regional issues in this country, and now kind of the overlay of the age issue, right? The older Canadians are looking for, more symbolic moves and the comfort of a familiar face and somebody with a good CV. And the younger Canadians are saying, it for the last 10 years, I've been hearing it, not only hearing it, but feeling it. It's not working for me. That's kind of under the undercurrent in all of this.
And what's happened to date is that the NDP vote has collapsed.
Yeah.
So the usual Liberal strategy, which is collapsing the progressive vote behind one option,
Yeah.
consolidating behind one option, is happening. Jagmeet Singh is not going to be treated well by
Yeah.
history as a
And
result
that's
of.
boosting the liberal numbers at this
Yeah.
point too. Yeah.
But the second thing that happened is a whole group of voters who said that they wanted change. They looked at Pierre Poilievre and said, this person at least represents change, regardless of what the content of the change is, at least represents change. But they never really jumped on board with either him or the conservative agenda or policies or
Right.
anything other than he just represents change. Those are the people who have moved and have put the Liberals in the position to be able to be competitive. That's the target group.
And the other thing that we're seeing kind of aside is that the separatist sentiment was on the rise in Quebec, and with Carney in the picture, that's kind of faded again, which again puts more votes in the liberal column.
Yeah, not a ton though. Not a ton. The Bloc Québécois is still right there. The Conservatives are still in the game there too.
Okay.
And that's the one I watch the most close. The two things to watch if you want to understand the election is, are the Liberals able to get themselves at least up to where they were in the last election campaign? And they're sort of around there now. They haven't galloped ahead. And
Right.
then the other one is, how are they doing in the province of Ontario? And the province of Ontario was a lot closer than they needed to be. And the
Yeah.
Conservatives are probably still leading in the 905. So even if the
Yeah.
two parties are tied, the way the votes distributed is the Conservatives are doing better in Ontario this time. The Liberals are doing a bit better in Quebec, and they're doing a lot better in Atlantic Canada. So
So,
it's not as efficient a vote as it was in the last two elections.
so are you telling us and suggesting that we might be looking at minority government either way?
Yeah, I think that based on today's numbers, that would have to be the conclusion you would come to. It would be a minority government either way, just like the last two governments were. And then you have to ask yourself the question, do the Liberals and the NDP have enough seats that they would have more than the Conservatives,
Yeah.
first of all? Well, actually, the combination of them would be a majority
Yeah.
because we basically had coalition governments the last two governments. Your NDP listeners get very upset when I say this, which
No,
is
but it's
it's a
yeah.
coalition. It's like, technically it's not. Nobody cares what the
No, but
technicalities
that's
are.
how it's
They
been
govern together.
functioning. Yeah.
Yeah, they govern together. So if they have enough to be able to take the majority of seats in the House of Commons, the Conservatives won't govern. The problem that they've got now, is, at least taking a look at the seat models, is the combination of the Liberals and the NDP aren't either a majority or more seats than the Conservatives will have, which looks like 2008.
Yeah. Wow. And then the NDP would have to do something about their leader, because the idea of teaming up with Jagmeet Singh again, given what's happened in the last 24 months, would not
Well,
be.
Senator, his problem is winning his seat.
Yeah, so that may take care of that. Darrell, so fascinating. Here we are, not election, not yet called, but so many things at play. Really always love talking to you about this stuff. You get inside our heads. That's what the pollsters need to do for us. Thanks so much. Travel
My
safe.
pleasure. Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Darrell Bricker, the head of Ipsos, the polling firm, with some really smart insights to what's going on in this country. That's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. We'll talk very soon. Thanks.